Hi, everyone. I am Leslie McAvoy. I'm chair of the philosophy department at ETSU, and I want to welcome you to the fourth Justice, Health, and Humanities lecture. We're very pleased to have Thomas Shapiro from Brandeis University here tonight, and I'm going to say a couple things about the origin of the lecture, and then Dr. Wykoff will introduce our speaker. This is one of the lectures that's given in the Leading Voices of Public Health series that the College of Public Health puts on. This particular lecture, the Justice, Health, and Humanities lecture, is co-sponsored between the College of Public Health and the Department of Philosophy. This collaboration kind of grew out of a course that faculty in our department and in public health were teaching on social justice issues as they relate to health and health outcomes. And we've extended that collaboration through the instituting of this lecture. And we've had several speakers over the years. And our goal is to foster dialogue across disciplines and across professions, and to highlight the important work that results from that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. So I want to thank you for coming, and here's Dr. Wykoff.
Thank you, Leslie. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everyone here. We're really excited to have Dr. Tom Shapiro with us from Brandeis University. As you can see, he's a professor of law and social policy and also the director of the Institute on Assets and Social Policy. More importantly, he is an internationally respected expert on racial inequality and especially the wealth gap as it impacts inequality in our country. He's probably best known, at least outside of academic circles, for the books that he's published, and I didn't want to get the titles wrong, but The Hidden Cost of Being African American, Black Wealth and White Wealth, which many of you have probably seen. And then the one that came out in March of this year called Toxic Inequality, How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. And it's really this idea of a wealth gap that I think is going to inform how we think about the social determinants of health in Appalachia. We've talked a lot about income inequality, but not as much about the wealth gap and what the implications of that are for folks in this region and around the country. So I'm really excited and looking forward to what Tom has to say. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Shapiro.
Thank you, Dr. Wykoff. It is an extreme pleasure for me to be here. So good evening, early evening to everybody. I'm at the tail end of a cold, so I'm actually a little more nasally than usual, just a little more. I first met Patricia Arroyo in 1998. Patricia was one of 187 families that we talked to in the period 1998 and 1999, where we wanted to talk to them about how their financial status, particularly how their family's wealth and their family's debt, helped to shape how they were thinking about their own futures, where they were going to live, the kinds of communities that they found attracted to, why they didn't like the communities they were living in at the time. And all of the families had young children, 5-year-old children. Patricia had 2 young daughters, Brittany and Brianna. We wanted to talk to families with young children because we also wanted to see, very importantly, how they were thinking about their children's future education and how they were helping to springboard them into a future, to an aspirational future of which all families had, white, black, and Hispanic, all the families that we talked to. When we first met with Patricia, she was then just coming off of what had been called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, formerly known as welfare in the United States, before a welfare reform under President Clinton in the mid-1990s. And the premise of that welfare reform was to move families and individuals to work. Patricia had just completed a work development program, if you will. She was a young mother, having grown up in South Central in the Watts area of Los Angeles. Her mother had been a single mother, also on welfare, also growing up in the south central part of Los Angeles. And so, in many ways, Patricia is at least a second, if not a third generation of very highly concentrated poverty, at least in urban centers in the United States. But she had just completed her courses, as she put it. She was learning about the computer. When we talked to her, she had just found her first job. And that first job was working at a public agency in the county of Los Angeles, starting to process some applications for that particular agency. The wages that she was paid then, and it's a family of Patricia and her 2 young daughters, she was basically being paid poverty wages. This was a period of time, and still is in many ways, where we measure poverty primarily just through looking at the income that a family has. And as we go along this evening, I'm going to mix that up a little bit by having us think about what that would look like if we added the family's financial assets and their debt into that picture. But Patricia was on the road. Patricia was on the road to what we will call a highly successful path. Not being fond of Watts in South Central, she moved to western part of Los Angeles, area called Culver City. I don't know if anybody is really familiar with the geography of Los Angeles, but she moved west, about 15 miles west or so toward the Pacific Ocean, because she was seeking a safer community for herself and her 2 young daughters. And this is an aspiration that kept coming across, not just from Patricia, but from a lot of the interviews and a lot of the families that we did and we talked to during this period of time. But unfortunately, at the subsidized rental apartment she found in Culver City, there were too many vivid reminders of Watts for her. She talked about guys hanging out in the alleys. She told us a story of the apartment being robbed one time when they were there, and talked about how dramatically traumatic that was, and she had to move again. She moved again. And she eventually started doing better at work. Her responsibilities increased, her income increased, her paycheck increased, so that she bought a house, also in the western part of Los Angeles, in a very hot real estate market. And she bought that house on the back of a really important federal program called Family Self-Sufficiency. And I will come back to this at a later point in the presentation, but put a pin in that federal program called Family Self-Sufficiency. It essentially allowed Patricia to save money. When you're in rent-subsidized housing in any part of the country, you pay rent based on what your income is. So the disincentive that operates is that as your work income increases, your rent goes up. What Family Self-Sufficiency does, it allows somebody like Patricia to escrow that money, to put it aside. She meets all the goals after 5 years. She used that as a check to pay a large down payment on a house that she would buy, also in near Culver City in Los Angeles. Well, Culver City turned out not to be the dreamboat that she thought it was. And she continued to have problems thinking about the safety in the community for herself and her daughters. So Patricia took a huge risk. She sold the house in Culver City and took, listen to this, it's the hot urban real estate market in Los Angeles, $112,000 of equity out of that house, and used that as a large down payment. And she purchased a house in one of the ex-bourbon places near Los Angeles called the Inland Empire, 60 miles away from her job, in a brand new development. Sort of halfway up on a hill. I've been in her community several times. Every time I go to Los Angeles, I have to drive by and see what's happening. Now, she bought that house with a huge down payment made from the equity of her first house that she bought. But she bought that house right before the foreclosure crisis. And as we know, the individuals in the communities that were hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis tended to be first-time homebuyers check for Patricia. In brand new or relatively new housing developments, check Patricia, double check. When we talked to Patricia again in 2010, and we organized the interviews about 12 years apart because we wanted to see what was happening with the then 5-year-olds in 98. Were they in high school? Were they graduating high school? Had they dropped out? How had all of the family's plans, how did that trajectory pan itself out? And what was the role, again, particularly of the family's wealth in making that plan happen, or the lack of wealth? What kind of barriers did that throw up? So for Patricia, the community around her was really hard hit by the foreclosure crisis. Literally, she told the story, and I drove through the neighborhood several times with my trained professional sociological eye to sort of verify what she was saying. Every third house or so had for sale signs. Sometimes it said foreclosure sale. About every third house also had a burnt lawn. Sometimes the windows might have been boarded up. There's no sign of people living there. People had given what the real estate finance industry calls a key payment. Instead of paying off the monthly mortgage, the family sent the key in and left. Patricia's house was underwater, meaning that she owed more in the mortgage than the house was valued at. Because every third house going underwater, going through a foreclosure process of some kind, the housing values dropped tremendously. Now it turns out that that particular housing development for Patricia was developed by a company called KB Homes. And I don't know if KB operates in this area or not. Tends not to be where their footprint is. But KB Homes advertises themselves as being a full-service operation. And part of their full-service operation was that they connected Patricia to a mortgage finance company called Countrywide. I see some people know what Countrywide is. If there is a poster child for predatory lending during the foreclosure crisis, the first one was Countrywide. They eventually went under. They were bought out by Bank of America in the long run. Patricia had what can be termed, she had predatory terms in her mortgage. One of the predatory terms was that she could not refinance that loan with another institution. She only had to offer it back to Countrywide. So that meant that she couldn't find more solid, firmer financial grounding for herself and her family. Now, along the way, Patricia married Frank. The story won't be all depressing. There's a lot of resiliency to tell in the story as well. Patricia married Frank also probably at an unfortunate time during the Great Recession or right before the Great Recession. Frank is a carpenter, but when we talked to Patricia, Frank had been unemployed for over a year. His unemployment insurance had just about run out. And there were clear, palpable tensions, at least as Patricia expressed them, about the stability of the marriage, because Frank could no longer contribute to the household. And that had been an important part of their joining together. The daughters, one of them was a track star and would get a track scholarship at a state university in California. The other daughter, slightly younger by a year or so, had some juvenile health issues with juvenile diabetes, had problems concentrating in school. Her grade point average was about a 2.0. She also ran track, but was not the star that her sister was. And she was not able to go to college, largely because Patricia had lost the money that she had invested and saved aside for her children's higher education. She had lost that $112,000 through the devaluation of land and homes during the foreclosure crisis. I like to start with this story, among other things, sort of underline the success of Patricia. From welfare, and by the way, not by the way, last time we talked to Patricia in the second interview in 2010, her salary was over $50,000. She had earned her way, at least by an income standard, into the American middle class. And she was doing pretty well. She had become a supervisor at work by that point. And clearly there was much brighter future ahead for Patricia, and is very resilient. While those around her were walking away from their homes, Patricia was steadfast and very resilient that she was going to find a way to keep paying her mortgage payments, because she didn't want to lose that house. She didn't want that to be an object lesson for her two daughters, Brittany and Brianna. And she held on to it. She was successful in that. So I also like to start with that story sometimes, because I want people to think a little bit about what do we have here. It shouldn't, and it doesn't matter from the telling of the story from this narrative. It doesn't matter that Patricia is white, black, or Hispanic. She is African American. But from the start of the story, that almost doesn't matter, because she's doing everything right. She's succeeding. She's following those rules. She's doing everything that we, quote unquote, tell her to do. But larger forces around her, like the housing crisis, like predatory lending, like the devaluation of property, raise up and throw very severe challenges to all the successes that the individual and the family in Patricia's case has had. And that's really why I like to start with that story, to think about how it is that we need to connect what seem like personal, individual, economic problems and issues to larger policies and larger forces and larger shapes in the society. And Patricia tells that through her own story. And Patricia's not the outlier. Maybe if we have time during question and answer, believe me, there are a lot of stories that I like to tell from this database. Of the original 187 families that we talked to, by 2010, we were able to re-interview 134 of them. And I was quite pleased with that rate. So how did I come up with the title, and why the title, if you will, of the book, Toxic Inequality? For me, the title is incredibly important because I'm really trying to make both a theoretical and a practical and a qualitative point here. And the point is that the period we are in the United States today is very different than just about any other period historians and social scientists can think about. And that's why I wanted to call it Toxic Inequality, to distinguish itself from the run-of-the-mill, ordinary inequality that we always seem to have with us, and nobody quote me, we always will have with us. I would suggest inequality is not the issue. It's about the scope and the magnitude, who bears it, and the meaning of it. So what is toxic inequality? What are the features? Let me go through several of them relatively quickly here. We have a convergence of historic highs in both income and wealth inequality. And for the statisticians and others in the audience, on the wealth side, our rendering of wealth inequality of what we know about typical American families, that data really only goes back to the mid-1980s. We have some sparse data sources that go back at different levels to pre-Depression era. But no matter what data we're looking at here, whether we're looking at Gini coefficients or quartiles or what the top 1% owns to the bottom 50%, all kinds of ratios that we look at, historic highs, both for income and wealth inequality. And both are continuing to go up and continuing to rise. Important point here for me also is to have us consider that as some of the work from Saez and Piketty and other economists and Gabe Suckman tell a very intriguing story. And the story they tell us is that both the wealth and the income inequality is driven by the very, very top. And they're talking about the top 1/10 of 1%. So a lot of the stories I'm going to tell today focus on the intersection, if you will, the tandomness of economic inequality and racial injustice. I could have done a presentation easily, and maybe we can talk about it in the question and conversation period, We easily could have done a presentation just looking at the white community, for example, and talk about some of the very same mechanisms operating here that are creating bigger and bigger economic divisions and growing inequality between the very, very top, the middle, and certainly those at the 50th percentile and below. It's one thing to think about growing inequality and historic highs in inequality if life, the living standards, seem to be getting better. And if it seems that the chances for economic mobility, the chances of moving ahead from where our parents were, are moving ahead over the course of our own working lifetime, but that's not the story. The story is, at the moment in the United States, and I would date it back to sometime in the early 1970s, we've been in this era close to 30 years now, at least 25, close to 30. We have the double negative of stalled living standards, immobility, economic immobility, and those are aggregate general statements. Obviously, there are parts of the population and there are outliers, and people do move ahead, and living standards do get better for some families, but looking at the general aggregate data, that's not the story that slice of the data tell us. So let me talk a little bit about wealth and income. And I think one of the most profound interventions that I try to make with my work is to help people understand the connectedness and the difference between income and wealth in the United States and elsewhere. Traditionally, we have, how do we measure poverty? We measure poverty by, the government puts out a figure it's an arcane way of doing it, but the government puts out a figure, and there are alternative ways of doing that figure, but all of them are based on family income. And if we can think of the metaphor of income as a stream, and most American families, by the end of the month, that stream is dry. It reproduces our daily existence. It pays our rent, our mortgage, our food, our clothing, our shelter, a little bit left over. For most American families, in fact, there's one family that we talked to that had this great expression, and the expression is, there are months where the month is longer than the paycheck. Those tend to be the months where they have 30 days and 31 days. February is always a much more welcome month, but there are fewer days. Those paychecks can stretch a little further. Income pays for our daily existence. And now let's think of wealth as something different, connected but different. Wealth is more like a pond. It's a storehouse. It's a reserve of financial resources, everything we have of value that can be sold, minus all of our debts. And it's really that simple. For most families that have financial wealth at all, it tends to be in the form of stocks and bonds, savings accounts, jewelry, businesses, business equity. But for most American families, by far, the largest reservoir of wealth that we have is in home equity. 2/3 of the wealth of that broad middle spectrum between the 20th and the 80th percentile, the 60% of us right smack in the middle of that ladder, the resource ladder, 2/3 of our wealth is in home equity. So we have to think of wealth differently than income in that sense as well. Home equity is not an individual attribute. Home equity has to do with the value of property. Home equity has to do with the formula upon which home ownership is financed in the United States. It's about the market that the government creates and the institutions we create and the tax code, which I'll get to, that helps many, many families subsidize their home ownership. So wealth is considerably different in that sense than income. Now, it is also absolutely the case that for most families, a high income is necessary to begin to accumulate wealth. And that relationship It comes through in all the work, all the research that we and other people do in this particular area. We also see. Oh, let me move to one of the slides here because I want to present just a little data. So the slides that I put, I've only got two data slides. Don't worry, I won't get overly wonky, but we can really dig into them. Believe me, I can really dig into them if we want during a conversation period. The Census Bureau just released, actually a week or 10 days ago, the latest data we have about family wealth in the United States, measured at the median, half above and half below. And this comes from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which the Treasury Department actually commissions every few years or so. And what the data show us is that the average, middle, 50th percentile white family has about $171,000 in financial wealth. Everything of value, including their home, minus all their debt, including their mortgages. Now, I want to stop on that for a moment. I shouldn't have to say this, and I'm feeling pedantic about it, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. That doesn't mean that all white families have $171,000. It means that at least 50% of white families have less, many considerably less. And it also means that a few very wealthy white families have considerably more. So we want to be able to parse that and understand what that intersection is going to look like. So let's move to the comparison with both African Americans and Hispanic families. For African Americans, the median is what? It's 17,600. For Hispanic families, it's 20,000. Do a quick ratio, which I think is important here. So what we're saying, what the data tell us, the story the data tells us, is that the average, at the median, African American family has what? It has a dime in wealth for every dollar of wealth that the white family has, at the median. And the Hispanic family does a little bit better, maybe what, 11, 12 cents on the dollar? So when wealth gets added to the picture of what economic inequality looks like, it has a very prominent racial and ethnic dimension to it, just as income inequality does. All right, so the dime on the dollar figure for African Americans to whites, the comparative figure, just so you get a quick picture of the landscape here. When we just look at income, the average African American income is about 60 cents on the dollar for what the average white income is. And think about the comparable differences here. If the project is to think about why is it, in social sciences we do think about why questions a lot, why is it that African Americans have 60 cents for every dollar of income that whites do? And that analysis has been done. It's been done ad nauseum. And when we actually control for enough factors, we can explain about 95% or so of the difference about where people are organized in the labor force, the sector of work they do, educational achievement, family structure, a whole lot of things build into that. Zip codes, where people live, a lot of things build into that. And economists like Barry Bluestone and others can do all those interesting controls and get us to about 95%, explaining about 95% of the difference. So we know, at least theoretically, philosophically, and we know a bit about what the political challenges is on how to drive towards parity on the income scale. And they're more of the, if you will, the traditional answers I think we've heard about. It's what? It's workforce development, it's work, it's education, and a few other things that we can throw in. But now let's think about the dime on the dollar of wealth. Not only is the scope and the magnitude really different, but we have to think about, oh my gosh, how did we arrive at a situation where African Americans only have a dime in wealth for every dollar of wealth that the median, they're measured at the medians. And how do we move, how do you define parity? What does equity look like in that situation? What's the goal, and how do we get there? And the answers are going to be very different than when we ask that question just about income. Because as I've indicated already, unlike income, most wealth that families generate, accumulate, and grow is not just their individual merit, but it occurs in an institutional context. And so thinking about wealth moves the conversation away from individual, a bit away from individual betterment, to include the conversation about what's the contribution of policy, what's the contribution of history, what's the legacy of race in America, and how does that play itself out in that getting to a dime on the dollar? And how does institutional arrangements, institutional discrimination play itself out and contribute to that? So that's the little project that I've been taking on for 20 odd years. I'm not sure how much progress I've made on it. Sometimes I despair. But usually I don't. Usually I don't find that work depressing, even if the audiences do sometimes, because I think we've got some answers. People may not like the answers, and they may seem politically, quote, impossible at the moment. All right, so this is what the extent, the cross-section of the data look like on race and wealth and economic inequality. We also want to ask the question, let me not give it away, we also want to ask the question, does that gap grow over time? Does it close over time? Or does it stay the same over time? Now think about the research, the null hypothesis here, if you will. And yes, I'm going to be a little sarcastic, if not snarky, so just bear with me for a moment or two. Because we live in a post-racial society, here's the laughter, that resulted from some hard-fought, hard-won, successful pieces of civil rights legislation on the part of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s that removed state and national barriers around property ownership, around higher education, around where people could live and where people could eat. But that's a bygone era. And that whatever history delivered to the United States as a nation by the mid-1960s or so, the rules of the game have changed, and they have changed. So we wanted to look at, and it's a piece of one of the pieces of research I'm most proud of and has had the most traction, if you will, with in the media, in social media and elsewhere. We were able to go back to a database. Not the interviews with families, because that's not a national random sample, if you will. But went to a database, something called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, that interviews the same families, has been interviewing the same families since 1964. And as the children grow up, the children get interviewed. And so that panel, that longitudinal set of data is from the social science point of view, and there are other better databases from the health point of view and the youth longitudinal point of view. But the Panel Study of Income Dynamics in 1984 started to ask families about their financial wealth and debts. So if 1984 gets used as a base or an anchor year in wanting to know what happened between 1984 and now, it's not that 1984 is a trick year. It's that that's just the first year the data was available. So following the same set of families who now are going through what? They're going through American institutions, American culture, American policy. American schools will arguably maybe the same, maybe not the same. What's happened? So the gap, the racial wealth gap, just looked at white-black for the moment, opens up, if you will. In 1984, it opens up at $84,000. Adjusting for inflation, that is, the dollars are real. Last measured in 2013, actually, the 2014 study, 2013 data, that gap, white-black, more than triples. It goes from $84,000 to $245,000. I do want to stop. Let people just look at that for a moment or two. I think there's some profound questions that need to be raised by looking at information like that. Because now we have an answer, a clear, abundantly clear answer to the question, what's happening in American society even after major civil rights successes. And I would suggest, and I'll give you some of the data in a moment, that what this allows us to focus a little more closely on, because now you're measuring the increase in a gap from 0.1 to 0.2. We don't have to account for the residual of history, the residual of legacy that gave us that starting point. If we were to analyze, which we have done, the growth in the space in the middle between 84 and 245, and run through a series of regression equations and other techniques with it, by far the largest driver of that threefold plus increase in the gap is around home ownership. It accounts for something like 45% of the growth in that racial wealth gap. And so what is home ownership? It's about housing markets. It's about how housing equity is created differently according to that great mantra of the real estate industry, place, place, place. The deconstruct of that is demographics, demographics, geographics. It matters who the community is made up of. It matters where the community is, urban, rural, concentrated poverty area, high income area, high wealth area, all of which are very highly correlated to how much the value of a house goes up and how quickly it goes up. That's the primary capture, if you will, that our analysis was able to do on explaining what explains the threefold plus increase in that racial wealth gap from 1984 to 2013 or so. So I want to move on and talk about, since we have identified, or I've tried to identify, and take it as a hypothesis at the moment, the ways in which contemporary and historic policy create and preserve inequality. And I mean both economic inequality, as it relates to everybody in American society, and material racial inequality, and especially the intersection, the tandemness of the two. So let me just give 3 examples of this at the moment. The United States tax code, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm about to talk about 5 minutes about the United States tax code. I can't imagine how sexy and jazzy that forebodes the next 5 minutes. But at least in Washington and elsewhere, it's on the media agenda. It's on the table about what's going to happen with the Trump proposals and elsewhere. And indeed, 1 or 2 of the ones that I'm going to talk about have become much more public in the last, within the last month. The U.S. tax policy, the code, actively redistributes wealth to the top. I can get away with that. I can say period, end of statement. And here's an illustration of that. The mortgage interest deduction. How many of you are homeowners? How many of you, like me, take the mortgage interest deduction? Many American families take the mortgage interest deduction. You have to file, you have to itemize your deductions, which means usually that your income has to be above a certain level. You have to have enough other expenses to be able to itemize. But essentially, if we itemize our deductions and take the interest we pay on our mortgages and put it on the tax form, we get a subsidy. And I'm using the word subsidy. We're not throwing that off. We use it's subsidy. We get a subsidy from the federal government to subsidize our home ownership. According to our tax bracket, the higher the income is, the more of the interest we get to take off. So you see, that's one way it operates. The other way it operates in the exact same way is that the higher your mortgage, the bigger the home, the higher the more interest you pay, the more you get to take off. So while in fact millions of us benefit from that, we invested as a society $72 billion last fiscal year in the mortgage interest deduction. If we add on to that the amount of property taxes that are excluded at the federal and sometimes at the state level because we're homeowners, and if we also take the third related part, if you will, not having to pay capital gains on the sale of a home, as long as we replace that housing within a couple of years. All three of those together is about $150 billion every single year that we invest in home ownership and related aspects of home ownership. It's one thing to think about from a policy point of view and from an equity point of view. If that $150 billion is somewhat equitably invested and thought about as housing security, housing as a social or a public good, I know the philosopher's ears just raised, I think. But I think it's an interesting argument to think about. We have done that. Maybe we've not called it that. It's one thing to think about if it helped people to find shelter and secure shelter and dug down into the population to the groups that really needed it, maybe more than others. We would think of it one way. But that's not the story, again, that the data tell us. The story the data tell us is that 84% of that $150 billion goes to the top 10% of income earners. And that's why the mortgage interest deduction is a hot potato political issue. It is a way that the federal government subsidizes inequality while it is subsidizing home ownership that largely benefits the wealthiest. There's some easy fixes to that, which I'll get to momentarily. But that's one way in which I feel totally confident of making the statement, tax policy actively redistributes wealth to the top, period. There are other examples. Let me just give two others fairly in a little sketchier form at the moment. Policy, not the tax code, but all kinds of policy provides both incentives and disincentives to save money. And it doles out the incentives and disincentives according to one's economic status. So if I save, and many of you I would suggest, if I save money for my child's higher education and I put it into a dedicated account in a number of different accounts that I can put it in, that account is tax shielded. I can put my earnings into that account, some earnings, and I don't pay taxes on it at the moment. It's a little more complicated. When it gets drawn out, some of it is taxable. Let's not worry about that for the moment. That is a way that policy actively provides incentives to me to do something that's considered to be a social good. Save money for the higher education of my children. Now, I and most families are going to, if they have the capacity, they're going to do that anyways. But if a mother on SNAP or food stamps or any kind of social assistance in many states in the United States does the exact same thing, puts money aside into a savings account dedicated for her child's college education or tutors or whatever they think is necessary, that family risks eligibility for the state and or federal program that they're partaking in. Different rules, same behavior. Good story, about half of the states in the United States have taken very serious reforms and have done some really good work on lowering, in many cases, or doing away with those kinds of controls about disincentives. So that in Maine, in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in Oklahoma, and literally about little more than half the states now, families below the poverty level that are eligible and receive benefits of some kind or another, they no longer risk their eligibility. But in almost half the states, that's still not the case. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and I suggest that we perhaps are in a part of the country where that work still needs to be done. Third example, the estate tax. See, this is a personal one I'm so passionate about. I love to talk about it because it's so horrible from my point of view. And obviously here you're getting a strong dose of Tom on this. Let me start with this statement though. A society cannot have the same set of values around large inheritances and equal opportunity. Inheritance is the enemy of equal opportunity. Large inheritance, especially. Inheritance perhaps also is the enemy of democracy, as we're learning more and more. And yes, we balance as a society. You know, the value that we hold, and it's very legitimate value, we value the legitimate value of wanting to give our children a head start, of giving them a platform in life, of getting them going, launching them. That's the phrase now that's often used. And that's usually done through financial resources in one way or another. We can't have the same high value on that or accommodation to that and seriously think it's a society that values equal opportunity. Because both can't happen. I had an interesting conversation a few weeks ago, actually about a month and a half ago, with a South African who was doing some work in the United States and was about to go back. I had the great opportunity of spending 6 months in South Africa on a Fulbright in 2011, so I pretend to know a little bit about South Africa and what goes on there. But Walter was bemoaning to me, it was really an incredible conversation, he was bemoaning to me that he was afraid that his daughter could not get into the best university. He lived around the Port Elizabeth area in the Eastern Cape. Couldn't get into the best university because South Africa had a system where his daughter's 90 on a high test, on a test score, an entrance exam, wouldn't make it because of some black African child who had a 79 would get in. You know, on face value, there's definitely a conversation to be had about that. Now, about 10 minutes later in the conversation, Walter shifts and is talking about the private school that his daughters go to, that he teaches at, that he helps teach at, because they're able to provide incredible amount of resources and learning experiences to the kids that the otherwise public system doesn't offer to everybody else. So, interesting question about how one thinks about, you know, what is equity in a situation like that? Is there any accommodation to be made? You know, you probably would surmise that I have some views on that, but just keep that as a question in mind at the moment. All right, so the estate tax in the United States. So what is the estate tax? If somebody, if a couple dies within a close proximity of each other, the first $11.4 million is excluded, is not taxed. And if an individual is half of that, it's you know, it's 5.7 to 5.8, it's somewhere in there. And as many attorneys will tell you, that individual, that couple, also has to be totally lawyer averse and hate lawyers because there's so many ways to get around it. Through family trust, through giving every child $14,000 every single year that's not taxable. They're incredible ways around it. But the estate tax, nonetheless, you have an estate of 11 point something million dollars for a couple, it becomes taxable. It's taxed right now at the rate of 35%. 35% of $1 over the excluded 11.45 million. So the tax rate is really not 35%. And Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives for several decades now have argued about the two mechanisms that operate here. Republicans and conservatives either want the exclusion rate to keep going higher and higher and higher or to be abolished entirely, which is the current Trump proposal. They want that to happen, and they want the rate to be lowered. And Democrats and liberals want the exact opposite. They want the exclusion level lowered or kept the same, and they want the tax rate to be bumped up. And they want the other tricks in it of sped up value basis of a stock, for example. So what happens is we get an argument. One of the arguments we get is the estate tax double taxes property, and it double taxes capital, and double taxes investment, and all that's been taxed already at least once, so what's the estate tax doing? I could imagine a situation where that might be the case. But let me give you an example of what we think is much more often the case. When the estate goes through probate, the property, the valuation of the property is not the value of the property at the time of death, it's the value of the property when it was acquired. So my wonderful grandmother, who invested $100 in Microsoft when it first came out, and passed away, this is mythical, but it's a good example, I think. If her estate were taxable, it would be the $100 that would be taxable, no matter how many zillion times the Microsoft stock had risen and the real value and the real wealth that it had created. That's another little trick in the estate tax, which should allow us to really interrogate the narrative that's put out there that says that those investments, those capital, has already been taxed at least once already. Sometimes it might have been, depending upon what the investment was, but much more often it seems not to have been that particular case. All right, the current proposals before us is to abolish the estate tax. Some people like to call it the death tax, right? For me, the estate tax reform, holding fast with it, is I think really important in itself, but it's also symbolic, because I think it tells us something about the values of a society. Do we want great, huge fortunes to be passed along untaxed, no recognition about what the village of the society might have contributed to creating that wealth, what a democracy, the cash value of a democracy, of regulations, of a market, of a police force, of a military that protected all that and allowed it to be done? Probably couldn't have been done in Sri Lanka, for example. So what is the impact? What is the impact that society might particularly have there? So it has that symbolic as well as political value for me about how we think about wealth in a society and how that wealth is created and how much of it is about the infrastructure around which we're able to create wealth in the United States. Okay, let me end with, on the more positive notes, if you will. Even if these things are not before us, even if we want to take the line, well, you know, Tom, great idea, but look at Washington, Look at state capitals. None of this is going to happen. Some of it is happening. But it had people in the civil rights movement taken that attitude in the 1950s, we never would have had civil rights legislation, never would have had a civil rights movement. People in South Africa taken that attitude in the 1950s, apartheid would still be with us. So have to think long term, think long game, think big picture sometimes, and how we get there. All right, so I want to start, if you will, with, I like to think about this agenda, if you will, in two ways. One is a macro equity agenda, and that's where the tax code comes in. I'm going to tell you some fixes to that real quickly. The other way to think about a transformative policy agenda towards equity, both for economic and racial equity, is to focus on individual families and focus on communities as well. So the tax code obviously is one of the more macro equity issues. Here's what we could do. It's real simple. We can make it flat. Everybody gets the same. That seems fair to me. You have shelter. Why having more expensive shelter entitles you to more? We could cap it. We could exclude second and third homes. We could make it refundable. And lastly, and really importantly, we could find a way to include renters. So in my state of Massachusetts, it's one of two states that does this. We have an analog to the mortgage interest deduction. Renters can take up to, depending upon your income level, up to $3,000 of your rent off of your state income taxes. The argument is homeowners get it as a subsidy. Renters also need shelter. So that's a relatively easy one. Obviously, the politics don't make it easy. Family self-sufficiency. It should be self-sufficiency, not sufficient. I apologize for whatever the spell check did. Of course, it wasn't me. Patricia, this brings us almost full circle, closing the loop with Patricia Arroyo. So Patricia bought that first home with the program Family Self-Sufficiency. As her income rose, she was part of a program that allowed her not to continue to pay increased rent because her income increased, but to have it put into an escrow account in her name. After 5 years, and after she met the goals of the program, she was able to take that money out and use it as a down payment on her first home. That's what got her into the home ownership market. The Institute I direct does some formal evaluations of family self-sufficiency programs throughout the country. One of the first ones we did was in Lynn, Massachusetts, formerly the General Electric headquarters and big manufacturer of engines and things, just north of Boston. Within the third month that we were looking at the program and the administrative records, a woman walked out of Lynn Housing Authority, moved out of public housing with a check for $18,000. That was money she had earned because she had increased her paid income by so much that was what was in her escrow. And she had gotten a second job, she had gotten job training, she had gotten more responsibilities, higher income. She went out and used that as a down payment on a home and set this incredible example for her daughter by doing that. Family self-sufficiency program is nowhere near scale. And by that I mean you have to be working. Now that's the main eligibility requirement. If you don't work, you can't increase your income at work. So really the program comes out of the Department of Labor as a very strong work incentive program, strangely enough, perhaps. Of those families or individuals that work, do paid work, that have rent subsidy or in public housing, only about 5% are in the family self-sufficiency program. And that's because of lack of capacity for the local housing authorities. We can get into that. Taking that to scale could provide pathways of mobility that don't exist for individuals like Patricia who are, I would suggest, primed for mobility, but need to be shown the right escalator that helps them. Two others, I'm going to skip over one or two here, just in the interest of time. Children's savings accounts. How many people here have heard of children's savings accounts? Is there any that you're familiar with in this area? All right, a couple of hands. Let me go through it relatively quickly. Children's savings accounts is a blossoming policy initiative and development all over the country. We see them in municipal areas. We see them in rural counties in Michigan. We see them at the state level. State of Maine has one. Oklahoma has a pilot or a demonstration project. The state of Nevada has one. It's got to break up the red-blue Republican Democratic distinctions here. It's a policy that goes across, at the moment at least, it goes across that political transom. The idea is to begin to have a family put money aside with some seed and or matching money from public or private or combination of public-private source that will help that child become college ready and go to college. So probably the one that's most well known is a program called K-2C, kindergarten to college, and started in the public school system in the city of San Francisco. Financed out of the treasurer's office in the city of San Francisco. And it's not very large. It puts in $50 to $100 for every kindergartner. The program got phased in, and in a couple of years, every public child in public school in the city of San Francisco will have accounts that keep growing. Other states and localities have the capacity to be more generous. Oakland, California, has a program that has a goal of putting $500 into accounts. And they just started it last year. And there are two different accounts, one called Promise Baby or Promise Child, and Children's Savings Accounts. And it's part of a, if you will, a social movement in the city of Oakland coming out of the mayor's office to improve the city of Oakland and the well-being and the aspirations of families and their children there. You're seeing children's savings accounts really blossom up all over the country, and it's an exciting development to see citizens and not-for-profits and government officials combining on. Lastly, I think it's really critical to reconnect the work-to-wealth pipeline. And by that I mean what sits in the middle of the work-to-wealth pipeline are benefits, paid sick leave, maternity, paternity leave, working for an employer that gives you access to a retirement and or savings plan, and maybe even seeds or matches it in some way. We've seen a narrowing, a closing off of those kinds of benefits in the American workplace over the last 30 to 40 years, and that maps on, or the map over that is where people work. And that explains why African Americans and Hispanics have about a 20% lower rate of retirement savings than white workers do. It's not because whites save more, African Americans save less. It's simply a matter of where they work. And it is a little more complicated than that. But the results from sort of the occupational segregation that maps over who has access to benefits in the United States. So I would last return again to Patricia Arroyo and suggest that the way I understand her story, she's very resilient, she's been very successful, and she's going to make it. There probably will be a lot more zigs and zags along her road. She has a great plan for her own retirement, about helping, she's been talking about going to the Peace Corps. She can help her community. Now it's time to help others after her daughters are totally launched, if you will, and she's secure about that. It seems to me it's the aspirations of people like Patricia Arroyo that we always have to have both in our hearts and our minds, and help to find ways of translating that to public policy and individual action to make her success more likely and have the challenges that are thrown up to her allow her to overcome them a little more easily. So I thank you for Patricia Arroyo and for your attention today. I will be happy to take questions or comments from the audience about any of the data, anything I've said. I just have one rule, and the rule is what I call 3 periods and a question mark. That is, there really is a question somewhere, and not just a speech. So thank you very much for your attention. So I think there's a mic that people can use because it's being recorded and being streamed.
Anyone have any questions? Warner?
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for coming. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My question has to do with the wealth versus income inequality, the 60 cents on the dollar versus the 10 cents on the dollar. In the business world, we talk about sort of fixed cost leverage, where if a significant portion of your costs are fixed, a 1% increase in revenue could represent a much larger increase in the bottom line. And to me, that it seems like you could be seeing a similar parallel there, where if a significant portion of your living costs are fixed, as your income goes up, you could see that magnified in the wealth. Yet I felt like you were somewhat either dismissive or felt that that wasn't the driving factor. So I'm curious what in the data really leads you to believe that other factors are more significant in defining the larger wealth gap.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for a great question. I was able to get back to this. So if we can temporarily dismiss the Great Recession here, if we look at the African American line, it's going up. And it's actually relatively healthily going up. And I've had somebody that projected out, well, at that rate of increase, the gap will be closed in 5,012 years or something like that. But at some point, the lines would come back together. The challenge, if you will, is that the white line is going up. It starts higher, and it continues to go up even higher. So I think that the connection between income and wealth is a really important one when we talk about how wealth is generated in the first place, and where we talk about, do families have disposable, so-called disposable income? What can be leveraged from that? And there's a whole conversation which I'm going to get to momentarily with that. But I wanted to point out with this chart, we're only looking, if you will, at the change in wealth time 1 to time 2 with the same set of families. So that's why in that particular data, the income doesn't rise all that much. It rises in a much more complicated way, which I actually don't want to talk about. It'll drive us off topic for the moment. But I think I want to get back to the part of the first question. One of the central tenets around the income and wealth conversation is the idea that the poor cannot save because their lives are so close to the margin already, and the act of saving means that they're giving up something that maybe we don't want them to give up. So a national demonstration project was started about 15 years ago, called the American Dream Demonstration, that was focused on piloting and demonstrating asset development accounts. And the prime, it came out of Michael Sherrod, and I don't know if anybody knows, he's sort of a prime mover, if you will, in the asset development movement. The prime research question he had was, can poor people save? And what are the conditions under which poor people could save? Well, the project had 13 sites, one random control experimental site in Oklahoma. And what they were able to conclude, the evaluators was a professional outfit. It was Apt Associates in Cambridge. And what they showed was, yes, poor people can save. Maybe the amounts don't look impressive to middle-class individuals, but against all odds, poor people can save. And these are the conditions under which it appears make savings among poor families much more likely. And it was a set of institutional conditions around being involved in an organization delivering the program that also provided periodic check-ins, maybe even financial coaching, a set of asset-based and wealth-producing financial coaching agendas around it. And that's the structure under which, at least that particular program demonstrated how poor people can save. It's still, it's still a part of, I would suggest, a part of the heart of the American cultural domain that poor people can't save. And that's why a lot of these so-called programs don't work. And the answers, the phony answers, I think, are around character and behavior, not necessarily understanding how close to the cliff families really are. And there are the studies that tell us now that about half the American population has less than $500 in savings. You know, if your car breaks an axle over a pothole or something, most American families go into debt. A lot of American families are in debt already. So that income, the leveraging that to wealth is problematic for families on that part of the economic ladder to begin with. But we know how to do it. I do, lastly on this, I do wonder about the sacrifices, and I think especially perhaps from a public health point of view, there may be sacrifices we know about that families make, like not refilling the prescription for another week, like making the dental appointment a year and a half instead of a year, all kinds of things that make absolute rational sense if your goal is X, but from a public health point of view, it may not. So, sorry, I thought I was done lecturing.
All righty. Well, Tom, thank you very much. And as always, we have some parting gifts for you because I know you're traveling up by plane and won't be able to put this in your carry-on bag, but we'll mail it to you.
Thank you.
We have some gifts and also the status of honorary professor in the College of Public Health at ETSU.
Oh,
so thank you so much for your
thank
time.
you, thank you, thank you. So does the college here have a mandatory retirement contribution system? So
the gifts from the faculty. Anyway, thanks to the Department of Philosophy and Humanities for co-sponsoring this evening, and thank you all for being here, and thank you all out in video land for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.